in the hallowed halls of Eldermere Palace, where centuries of tradition cast long shadows over marble floors, a single security report would shatter the delicate balance of power that held the royal family together. When Queen Consort Isabella's protection detail was suddenly suspended by King Edward VII, whispers began to echo through the corridors about Princess Catherine's mysterious safety concerns. But in a world where loyalty is currency and secrets are weapons, the truth behind this unprecedented decision would prove more dangerous than anyone could imagine. What began as a routine security assessment would soon unravel a web of deception, betrayal, and hidden agendas that threatened to destroy the monarchy from within. The morning sun cast golden streams through the towering windows of Eldermere Palace's east wing, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny secrets waiting to be discovered. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the palace's chief security coordinator, walked briskly down the marble corridor, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished stone. In her leather portfolio, she carried a document that would change everything, a comprehensive safety assessment that had taken her team 3 months to compile. The palace had been her second home for 15 years, ever since she'd transitioned from her role as a senior intelligence officer with the Royal Protection Command. Every portrait lining the walls, every ornate door handle, every hidden passage known only to the inner circle, Margaret knew them all. She understood the intricate dance of palace life, where protocol and politics intertwined like lovers in an eternal waltz. As she approached the king's private study, Margaret reflected on the events that had led to this moment. 3 months ago, Princess Catherine had approached her with concerns that seemed almost paranoid at first glance. The princess had noticed unusual patterns in Queen Consort Isabella's daily routines, unexplained changes in staff assignments, and what she described as an atmosphere of manufactured normalcy surrounding her stepmother's activities. Catherine, known for her analytical mind and attention to detail, had documented everything meticulously. She'd observed how Isabella's personal assistant, James Morrison, had been replaced without explanation. She'd noted the installation of new security cameras in areas previously considered private. Most concerning of all, she discovered encrypted communications between Isabella's security detail and unknown external parties. Initially, Margaret had dismissed these observations as the natural tensions that arose in blended royal families. After all, Isabella had married King Edward only 2 years prior, and the adjustment period for everyone involved was still ongoing. However, Catherine's persistence and the specificity of her concerns had eventually convinced Margaret to conduct a thorough investigation. The investigation had revealed disturbing patterns. Isabella's head of security, Colonel Marcus Ravenscroft, had been making unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence operatives. Financial records showed unexplained payments to offshore accounts linked to Ravenscroft's personal holdings. Most troubling of all, surveillance footage had captured several instances of sensitive state documents being photographed in Isabella's private quarters. Margaret paused outside the king's study, taking a deep breath before knocking. King Edward VII was a man of principle, but he was also deeply in love with his new wife. The information she was about to present would force him to choose between his heart and his duty to the crown. "Enter," came the familiar voice from within. King Edward sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing correspondence with the focused intensity that had characterized his entire reign. At 62, he remained an imposing figure, with silver hair that caught the light and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see through any deception. The lines around his eyes spoke of the weight of responsibility he'd carried since ascending to the throne 8 years ago. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, placing the portfolio on his desk, "I've completed the security assessment you requested regarding the palace's current protection protocols." Edward looked up, immediately sensing the gravity in her tone. "I trust everything is in order." Margaret hesitated for a moment. In her years of service, she'd never had to deliver information that would personally devastate the monarch. "I'm afraid not, Your Majesty. The investigation has revealed serious security breaches that require immediate attention." She opened the portfolio and began laying out photographs, documents, and surveillance reports. Edward's expression grew increasingly grave as she explained each piece of evidence. The unauthorized communications, the financial irregularities, the compromised documents, each revelation built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of betrayal. "Colonel Ravenscroft has been Isabella's head of security since before your marriage," Margaret explained carefully. The evidence suggests that his activities began approximately 6 months after the wedding ceremony. We believe he may have been compromised by foreign intelligence services, though his exact motivations remain unclear. Edward studied the documents in silence, his face a mask of controlled emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but strained. "And Isabella, what is her level of involvement?" "That remains unclear, Your Majesty. The evidence shows that sensitive materials were accessed from her private quarters, but we cannot determine whether she was aware of this access. However, given the scope of the security breaches, protocol requires the immediate suspension of her current protection detail pending a full investigation." The king stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, where Isabella could be seen taking her morning walk with Lady Victoria Pembroke, her closest confidant. The sight of his wife, elegant and serene in her pale blue dress, made the decision ahead even more painful. "Princess Catherine brought these concerns to your attention?" he asked without turning around. "Yes, Your Majesty. Her observations were instrumental in uncovering these irregularities. She's been quite thorough in her documentation." Edward nodded slowly. Catherine had always been perceptive, perhaps too much so for palace life. As his daughter from his first marriage, she'd grown up understanding the delicate balance between personal relationships and state security. Her concerns about Isabella had clearly been well-founded. "What are your recommendations?" he asked, finally turning back to face Margaret. "Immediate suspension of Isabella's current security detail, replacement with vetted personnel from the Royal Protection Command, and a comprehensive investigation into all personnel who have had access to sensitive materials over the past 18 months. We'll also need to review all state documents that may have been compromised and assess potential damage to national security interests." The weight of the decision settled heavily on Edward's shoulders. Suspending Isabella's security detail would send shockwaves through the palace staff and inevitably reach the media within days. The implications for their marriage, for Isabella's reputation, and for the monarchy itself were staggering. Yet he knew Margaret was right. The evidence was too substantial to ignore, and his duty as king had to supersede his personal feelings. The security of the realm had been compromised, and swift action was necessary to contain the damage. "Implement your recommendations immediately," he said finally. "Brief the new security team personally and ensure that all evidence is secured. I want hourly reports on the investigation's progress." "Yes, Your Majesty. There's one more thing." Margaret hesitated again. "Given the sensitivity of the situation, I recommend limiting knowledge of the investigation to essential personnel only. The fewer people who know the full scope of what we've discovered, the better we can control the narrative if this becomes public." Edward nodded grimly. "Agreed. Who else knows about this?" "Myself, my deputy investigator, and Princess Catherine. That's all." "Keep it that way for now. I'll need to speak with Catherine privately about her role in this discovery. Her insights may be valuable as we move forward." As Margaret gathered her documents and prepared to leave, Edward felt the weight of betrayal settling into his bones. Isabella had brought joy back into his life after years of loneliness following his first wife's death. The thought that their marriage might have been built on deception was almost unbearable. Yet even as his heart broke, his mind was already working through the implications. If Isabella was innocent, this investigation would clear her name but destroy their trust. If she was complicit, the scandal would rock the monarchy to its foundations. Either way, their marriage would never be the same. After Margaret left, Edward stood alone in his study, looking out at the gardens where Isabella continued her morning walk, unaware that her world was about to change forever. In a few hours, her familiar security detail would be replaced by strangers, and questions would begin that might never have satisfactory answers. The king picked up his secure phone to call Catherine. As his daughter, she deserved to know how her concerns had led to this moment. As a member of the royal family, she needed to understand the role she would play in the difficult days ahead. But first, he had to find the strength to continue pretending that nothing had changed when Isabella returned from her walk. The performance of normalcy had begun, and it would continue until they understood the full extent of the betrayal that had infiltrated their most intimate spaces. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the palace grounds where secrets had lived for generations. Today, some of those secrets would finally see the light, while others would burrow deeper into the darkness, waiting for their moment to emerge and reshape the destiny of the crown itself. The afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows of Princess Catherine's private office, casting colorful patterns across the Persian rug that had belonged to her grandmother. Catherine sat at her writing desk, reviewing the morning's events with the methodical precision that had first alerted her to the irregularities surrounding Isabella's security arrangements. Her phone buzzed with a message from Lady Margaret. Phase 1 complete. New detail in position. Catherine closed her eyes and took a deep breath. 3 months of careful observation and documentation had led to this moment, but she felt no satisfaction in being proven right. The implications of what they'd discovered went far beyond simple security breaches. They threatened the very foundation of her father's happiness and the stability of the monarchy itself. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting her personal secretary with the afternoon briefings. Instead, her father entered, his usually composed demeanor showing subtle signs of strain that only she would notice. "Father," she said, rising immediately. Even in private, royal protocol demanded respect, though their relationship had always been closer than traditional monarch-child dynamics typically allowed. "Catherine, please sit. We need to discuss what you've set in motion today." Edward took the chair across from her desk, a departure from his usual preference to stand during serious conversations. She studied his face carefully. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they had that morning, and there was a heaviness in his posture that spoke of emotional exhaustion. "I know this wasn't easy for you to authorize." "Easy?" Edward let out a bitter laugh. "My daughter, acting on suspicions about my wife, has uncovered what appears to be a significant security breach involving the woman I love. No, Catherine, easy doesn't begin to describe this situation." The weight of his words settled between them. Catherine had known this conversation would be difficult, but hearing the pain in her father's voice made her question whether she'd done the right thing. Still, the evidence was undeniable, and her loyalty to the crown had to supersede personal considerations. "I want you to understand something," Edward continued, leaning forward in his chair. "Your observations were meticulous, your concerns were valid, and your actions may have prevented a much larger catastrophe. But I need to know what first made you suspicious of Isabella." Catherine had anticipated this question, but answering it required her to reveal observations that might seem petty or jealous to an outside observer. "It wasn't any single incident," she began carefully. "It was a pattern of small changes that, individually, could be explained away, but collectively suggested something more significant." She moved to her filing cabinet and withdrew a leather journal, one of several she'd used to document her observations. It started 6 months ago when Isabella's routine began changing in subtle ways. She'd always been punctual for family dinners, but suddenly she was frequently delayed by urgent calls that lasted exactly 15 minutes. When I asked about the calls, she would give vague explanations about charitable organizations or personal matters. Edward listened intently as Catherine walked him through her methodology. She'd noticed that Isabella's personal assistant, James Morrison, had been replaced without announcement or explanation. The new assistant, Sarah Chen, was highly qualified but had no previous experience in royal households, an unusual hearing choice given the sensitivity of the position. Then there were the technology upgrades, Catherine continued, flipping through her journal pages. Isabella requested enhanced security systems for her private quarters, claiming she felt unsafe despite having round-the-clock protection. The new cameras had capabilities far beyond what would be necessary for personal security. They included encrypted transmission features and remote access protocols. The princess had also documented changes in Isabella's relationship with various staff members. Long-serving palace employees who had previously enjoyed Isabella's favor suddenly found themselves reassigned or facing disciplinary actions for minor infractions. Meanwhile, newer staff members, many hired through Colonel Ravencroft's recommendations, gained unprecedented access to sensitive areas of the palace. But the most concerning pattern was the documents, Catherine said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. State papers that should have remained in Father's study or the secure briefing room were appearing in locations where Isabella spent time, not consistently enough to suggest deliberate theft, but frequently enough to indicate systematic access. Edward absorbed this information with growing concern. Each detail Catherine presented painted a picture of calculated intelligence gathering, not random security lapses. You documented all of this without alerting anyone to your suspicions. I had to be certain, Catherine replied. Accusations against the Queen Consort couldn't be based on hunches or circumstantial evidence. I needed proof that would withstand scrutiny, especially given the personal relationships involved. The king stood and walked to the window, much as he had in his study that morning. The palace grounds stretched out before them, peaceful and orderly, giving no hint of the turmoil brewing within the ancient walls. Margaret believes Colonel Ravencroft has been compromised by foreign intelligence services. Do you agree with that assessment? The evidence supports that conclusion, Catherine said carefully. But I think the situation may be more complex than simple espionage. Some of Ravencroft's actions seem designed to create instability within the family rather than gather intelligence for external purposes. This observation intrigued Edward. Explain. Catherine joined him at the window, choosing her words carefully. Traditional espionage focuses on acquiring information while maintaining the status quo to ensure continued access. But Ravencroft's activities seem designed to create tension and distrust among family members. The changes in staff, the subtle alterations to routine, the strategic placement of sensitive documents. It's almost as if someone wanted the security breaches to be discovered. The implications of this theory were staggering. If Catherine was correct, then the entire situation might be part of a larger plan to destabilize the monarchy from within. But that raised the question of Isabella's role. Was she a willing participant, an unwitting pawn, or something else entirely? Have you considered that Isabella might be a victim in this scenario? Edward asked, voicing the hope that had sustained him through the morning's revelations. I've considered every possibility, Catherine replied honestly. Isabella is intelligent and observant. It's difficult to believe she would be completely unaware of the changes in her security arrangements and staff. However, it's equally possible that she's been manipulated by people she trusted. They stood in contemplative silence, watching as Isabella's new security detail maintained their positions around the garden where she continued her afternoon activities. From this distance, the change in personnel wasn't obvious, but Catherine knew Isabella would notice the unfamiliar faces soon enough. What happens next? Edward asked. Margaret's team will conduct discreet interviews with all personnel who have had access to sensitive materials. They'll also analyze the encrypted communications and financial records to determine the full scope of the security breach. Depending on what they discover, we may need to involve external intelligence agencies. Edward nodded grimly, and Isabella. That decision rests with you, Catherine said softly. As king, you have to prioritize the security of the realm. As a husband, you have to decide how much you're willing to risk for the possibility that she's innocent. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Edward had spent his entire adult life balancing personal desires with royal duties, but this situation demanded a choice that could destroy either his marriage or his throne, possibly both. I want you to continue your observations, he said finally, but be extremely careful. If your theory is correct and this is part of a larger plan to destabilize our family, then your investigation has likely been noticed. Watch for changes in how people interact with you, especially staff members who have been recently hired or promoted. Catherine nodded. I've already taken precautions. My journals are kept in a secure location, and I've documented everything in code that would be meaningless to casual observers. Good. We'll meet again tomorrow evening to review Margaret's findings. Until then, we maintain normal routines and give no indication that anything has changed. As Edward prepared to leave, Catherine felt compelled to address the elephant in the room. Father, I hope you know that I take no pleasure in any of this. Isabella brought happiness back into your life, and I genuinely hoped my suspicions were unfounded. Edward paused at the door, his hand on the ornate handle. I know, my dear. Your loyalty to the crown has always been absolute, even when it comes at personal cost. That quality will serve you well when you inherit the throne, though I pray these current circumstances don't accelerate that timeline. After he left, Catherine returned to her desk and opened a secure communication channel to Lady Margaret. The investigation was entering its most delicate phase, and they needed to move quickly before their targets realized how much had been discovered. But even as she began composing her encrypted message, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The evidence against Ravencroft was substantial, but something about the entire situation felt orchestrated, as if they were discovering exactly what someone wanted them to find. Outside her window, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the palace walls in shades of gold and amber that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas. Tonight, she would continue her careful observations, watching for the subtle signs that would reveal whether they were hunters or prey in this dangerous game of loyalty and betrayal. The stakes had never been higher, and Catherine suspected that the most dangerous moves were yet to come. The pre-dawn hours at Eldermere Palace were typically the quietest time of day, when even the most dedicated staff members caught brief moments of rest before the royal household awakened. However, on this particular morning, Lady Margaret Thornfield was already at her desk in the Security Command Center, reviewing overnight surveillance reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the situation they faced. Her deputy, Commander James Harrison, entered carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the grim expression that had become commonplace since their investigation began. At 55, Harrison was a veteran of both military intelligence and royal protection services, and his instincts had proven invaluable in uncovering the intricate web of deception they now faced. "The overnight intercepts confirm your suspicions," Harrison said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. "The communications between Ravencroft and his external contacts increased dramatically after Isabella's security detail was changed yesterday." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully and reviewed the transcripts Harrison had prepared. The intercepted messages were coded, but the pattern was clear. Their investigation had triggered a response from whoever was orchestrating the security breaches. More concerning still, the communications suggested that the operation was entering a new phase. "Any indication of what they're planning?" Margaret asked. "Not specifically, but the tone has shifted from intelligence gathering to damage control. It appears they're preparing for the possibility of exposure." Harrison pulled out a tablet displaying communication patterns over the past 72 hours. "Look at this frequency analysis. Before yesterday, Ravencroft's contacts followed a regular pattern, brief communications every 48 hours, always at the same times. Since the security change, the pattern has become erratic, with multiple contacts at unusual hours." Margaret studied the data with growing concern. In her experience, erratic communication patterns often preceded desperate actions. If their investigation had cornered dangerous people, the next few days would be critical in preventing whatever countermeasures they might be planning. "What about Isabella's reaction to the security change?" she asked. "That's where things get interesting," Harrison replied, pulling up another set of reports. "She noticed the personnel change immediately, as expected, but her response was calculated. She asked specific questions about the new team's qualifications and requested detailed information about their previous assignments. Most people in her position would express concern or confusion, but Isabella seemed to be evaluating the new security arrangements for vulnerabilities." This information troubled Margaret deeply. If Isabella was innocent, her reaction should have been worry about why the change was necessary, not an assessment of the new team's capabilities. However, if she was involved in whatever Ravencroft was orchestrating, her behavior made perfect sense. She was gathering intelligence to share with her co-conspirators. "Have you briefed the new security team about these concerns?" Margaret asked. "Partially. They know they're part of an ongoing security investigation, but I haven't shared details about Isabella's potential involvement. However, I've instructed them to document her movements and communications meticulously." Margaret nodded approvingly. The new security team consisted of hand-picked professionals with impeccable records and no previous connection to palace politics. If Isabella was planning something, they would detect it. A secure phone on Margaret's desk buzzed with an incoming message from Princess Catherine. The coded text was brief but urgent. "Unusual activity in East Wing. Need immediate consultation." "We need to get to Princess Catherine," Margaret told Harrison, grabbing her secure communication device and encrypted tablet. "Something's happening." They made their way through the palace's service corridors, avoiding the main hallways where early morning staff were beginning their daily routines. The East Wing housed Catherine's private apartments as well as several guest suites that were occasionally used by visiting dignitaries, or extended family members. Catherine met them at a discreet side entrance, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. She wore a casual sweater and jeans, highly unusual for a princess, even in the early morning hours, and her expression was tense with concern. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading them toward her private study. "I've been monitoring the situation since 3 o'clock this morning, and I believe we may have a more immediate problem than we realized." She showed them to a small alcove overlooking the palace's internal courtyard, where they had a clear view of the East Wing's service entrance. "Isabella left her quarters at 2:30 a.m., Catherine explained. She used the service corridors to avoid her new security detail and met with someone in the old servants' quarters." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The old servants' quarters had been converted to storage years ago and were rarely accessed by anyone except maintenance staff. A clandestine meeting there at such an unusual hour could only mean one thing: Isabella was actively participating in whatever conspiracy they'd uncovered. "Did you see who she met with?" Harrison asked. "That's the interesting part," Catherine replied, handing him a pair of high-powered binoculars. "It wasn't Colonel Ravencroft, as I expected. It was Sarah Chen, her personal assistant." This revelation added another layer of complexity to their investigation. Sarah Chen was the replacement assistant who had been hired 6 months earlier, around the time the security irregularities began. If she was meeting secretly with Isabella in the early morning hours, it suggested a level of coordination that went far beyond simple opportunistic espionage. "How long did the meeting last?" Margaret asked. "Approximately 20 minutes. They appeared to be reviewing documents. I saw Chen show Isabella several pages of what looked like official correspondence. After the meeting, Isabella returned to her quarters through the same route, and Chen left the palace grounds through the service gate." Margaret and Harrison exchanged glances. This was the evidence they'd been hopping to find, a proof of Isabella's active involvement in the security breaches. However, it also meant the situation was more dangerous than they'd initially assessed. "We need to intercept Chen when she returns," Margaret decided. "If she's carrying documents from this meeting, they could provide crucial evidence about the scope of the conspiracy." "There's something else," Catherine said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I overheard part of their conversation. Isabella asked Chen about the timeline and whether the package was ready for delivery. Chen assured her that everything was proceeding according to plan and that the final phase would begin within 48 hours. The implications were staggering. Whatever operation they were investigating wasn't just about intelligence gathering. It was building toward something specific, something that would happen within the next 2 days. "We need to brief the king immediately," Margaret said. "This has moved beyond a security investigation. We're potentially dealing with an active plot against the monarchy." However, Catherine shook her head. "I don't think that's wise, at least not yet. Father is already struggling with the personal implications of this situation. If we tell him that Isabella is actively conspiring against the crown without having complete evidence, it could prompt him to take actions that might compromise our investigation." Margaret understood Catherine's concern, but the urgency of the situation was escalating rapidly. "What do you propose?" "Give me until tonight to gather more information. Isabella's behavior will likely change now that her security detail has been replaced. If we can document additional evidence of her involvement, we'll have a stronger case when we brief Father." It was a risky strategy, but Catherine's reasoning was sound. King Edward's emotional investment in Isabella could indeed compromise their investigation if he confronted her prematurely. However, delaying action also carried significant risks if Isabella and her co-conspirators were planning something dangerous. "I can have surveillance teams monitor both Isabella and Chen discreetly," Harrison offered. "If they're moving towards some kind of final phase, we'll detect additional activity." Margaret weighed their options carefully. Every instinct told her to act immediately, but Catherine's political insight and Harrison's operational experience both suggested patience might yield better results. 24 hours, she decided finally. "We'll maintain intensive surveillance and gather additional evidence, but if we detect any immediate threat to the royal family or state security, we act regardless of the political consequences." As they concluded their early morning meeting, the palace began to stir with the normal activities of royal life. Somewhere in the building, Isabella was presumably sleeping peacefully after her clandestine meeting, unaware that her secret activities had been observed and documented. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The phrase, "final phase," suggested that whatever Isabella and her conspirators were planning would happen soon, and once it began, it might be too late to prevent serious damage to the monarchy and the nation it represented. The next 24 hours would determine whether their careful investigation could prevent a catastrophe, or whether the shadows that had infiltrated the palace would succeed in their mysterious but undoubtedly dangerous goals. The atmosphere in Eldermere Palace had grown noticeably tense as the day progressed, though to casual observers, nothing appeared different from the usual royal routine. King Edward maintained his scheduled appointments, Princess Catherine attended her charity meetings, and Queen Consort Isabella hosted her weekly tea with prominent society ladies. However, beneath this facade of normalcy, a complex game of surveillance and counter-surveillance was unfolding that would determine the fate of the monarchy. Lady Margaret had positioned her most trusted agents throughout the palace, each monitoring different aspects of Isabella's activities while maintaining the appearance of routine security operations. The morning had yielded disturbing intelligence: 3 separate phone calls to encrypted numbers, a request to review state papers that she had no official reason to access, and most concerning of all, a private meeting with Lord Pemberton, the Minister of State Security. Commander Harrison reviewed these developments with growing alarm as he prepared his afternoon briefing. Lord Pemberton's involvement added a political dimension that complicated their investigation significantly. As the government official responsible for national security matters, Pemberton had legitimate reasons to meet with members of the royal family. However, the timing and secretive nature of today's meeting suggested something more sinister. Princess Catherine had also made a disturbing discovery during her own discreet observations. While attending a cultural arts committee meeting in the palace's West Wing, she'd noticed Sarah Chen entering areas of the building that were supposed to be restricted to senior staff members. More troubling still, Chen appeared to be photographing architectural details and security installations with a device that looked far more sophisticated than a typical smartphone. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Margaret received word that Chen had been observed leaving the palace grounds with a briefcase that she hadn't carried when arriving that morning. This development prompted Margaret to make a difficult decision. It was time to intercept Chen and discover what she was carrying. The interception was planned for a location several miles from the palace, where Chen regularly stopped at a small cafe that offered secure Wi-Fi connections. Margaret's team had identified this location as a potential communication point where Chen might be transmitting information to external contacts. Detective Inspector Sarah Reynolds, one of Margaret's most experienced operatives, approached Chen's table under the pretext of being a fellow customer seeking to share a crowded cafe table. However, what Reynolds discovered when she glimpsed the contents of Chen's briefcase was far worse than anyone had anticipated. The briefcase contained detailed floor plans of the palace's secure areas, including the king's private study, the state document storage facility, and most alarmingly, the emergency evacuation routes that would be used in case of a security threat. More disturbing still were photographs of sensitive state documents, including correspondence with foreign governments and classified intelligence reports. But the most chilling discovery was a timeline document that outlined a plan called Operation Royal Flush. The timeline indicated that tomorrow evening, during a state dinner honoring the visiting ambassador of Meridia, a coordinated series of events would unfold that would force King Edward to abdicate in favor of a regency government led by Queen Consort Isabella. Reynolds immediately contacted Margaret with this intelligence, triggering an emergency response that brought the investigation team together in the palace's secure command center. The evidence was now overwhelming. Isabella was not just involved in espionage activities, but was actively leading a conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate government. "The plan is sophisticated and well-coordinated," Margaret explained to Catherine and Harrison as they reviewed the intercepted documents. "Tomorrow's state dinner provides the perfect cover because it will bring together government officials, foreign dignitaries, and media representatives in one location." The timeline revealed that the conspiracy had multiple components designed to create a crisis of confidence in King Edward's leadership. Fabricated evidence of financial improprieties would be released to the media simultaneously, with manufactured intelligence, suggesting that the king had compromised national security through his personal relationships. In the resulting chaos, Isabella would position herself as the stability candidate, supported by key government officials who were either compromised or complicit in the plot. Lord Pemberton's involvement makes sense now, Catherine observed grimly. He has the authority to invoke emergency security protocols that could effectively place Isabella in control during a crisis period. Harrison studied the operational details with professional admiration mixed with horror. This isn't the work of foreign intelligence services, he concluded. The planning is too sophisticated and too focused on internal political dynamics. This is a domestic conspiracy with international support. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. They had uncovered a plot that threatened not just the current monarch, but the entire constitutional system that had governed the nation for centuries. However, they now faced a critical challenge: how to prevent the conspiracy from succeeding without triggering the very crisis it was designed to exploit. "We have to brief the king immediately," she decided. "The evidence is too substantial to ignore, and we have less than 18 hours before the conspiracy moves into its active phase." However, Catherine raised a troubling concern. "If we reveal everything we know, Father will have to take immediate action against Isabella. That action itself could trigger the crisis the conspirators are hoping to create. The media will portray it as a jealous daughter manipulating her father against his new wife." The dilemma was clear. Action and inaction both carried enormous risks. If they moved against the conspiracy, they might provide their enemies with the chaos they needed to succeed. If they waited, they might miss their opportunity to prevent a constitutional crisis. "There's another consideration," Harrison added. "We still don't know the full extent of the conspiracy. Isabella and Chen are clearly central figures, but Lord Pemberton's involvement suggests that other government officials may be compromised. If we act prematurely, we might expose our investigation without neutralizing all the threats." Margaret made the difficult decision to request an immediate private audience with King Edward. The evidence they'd gathered was too serious to delay action any longer, and the king needed to understand the full scope of the threat he faced. An hour later, the three investigators found themselves in the king's private study, where Edward listened with growing shock and anger as they presented the evidence of Isabella's betrayal. The photographs of sensitive documents, the floor plans of secure areas, and most damning of all, the timeline for Operation Royal Flush painted a picture of deception that went far beyond anything he had imagined possible. "How long have you known about this conspiracy?" Edward asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the obvious emotional turmoil the revelations caused. "The full scope became clear only in the last few hours," Margaret replied honestly. "We knew about the security breaches and suspected Isabella's involvement, but the evidence of an active plot to force your abdication was discovered this afternoon." Edward stood and walked to his window, looking out at the palace grounds where tomorrow's state dinner preparations were already underway. The irony was not lost on him. The very event meant to demonstrate the strength and stability of his reign would be used as the setting for his downfall. "What are your recommendations?" he asked finally. "We have two options," Margaret explained. "We can act immediately to arrest the conspirators and prevent tomorrow's operation, or we can allow the conspiracy to proceed while monitoring it closely, hoping to identify all participants before making arrests." Both options carried significant risks. Immediate action might prevent the crisis but could appear arbitrary and vindictive, especially given Isabella's popular status. Allowing the conspiracy to proceed was extremely dangerous, but might provide the evidence needed to prosecute all participants and fully expose the threat to the monarchy. King Edward turned back to face his advisors, and for the first time in Catherine's memory, her father looked every day of his 62 years. The weight of betrayal and the burden of the decision ahead had aged him visibly in the space of a single afternoon. "I need time to consider our options," he said quietly. "Continue your surveillance and be prepared to act on my orders. Whatever happens tomorrow, the monarchy will survive this challenge." As the investigators left the king's study, none of them could have predicted that the most dangerous phase of the conspiracy was yet to begin, and that Isabella's next move would force them into a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of King Edward's reign, but the future of the constitutional monarchy itself. The morning of the state dinner dawned gray and overcast, as if the weather itself sensed the tension that permeated every corner of Eldermere Palace. King Edward had spent a sleepless night weighing his options, ultimately deciding on a strategy that would allow the conspiracy to reveal itself fully while protecting the monarchy from irreparable damage. It was a dangerous gamble, but one that offered the best chance of exposing all participants in what had become known as Operation Royal Flush. Lady Margaret's security teams had been positioned throughout the palace with extraordinary care, each operative knowing that the next 12 hours would determine whether they prevented a constitutional crisis or witnessed the downfall of the government they had sworn to protect. Hidden cameras and listening devices had been installed in locations where the conspirators were likely to coordinate their final preparations, and backup security teams stood ready to intervene at a moment's notice. Princess Catherine had volunteered to play a crucial role in the day's events, using her position to monitor Isabella's activities and provide real-time intelligence to the security teams. It was a dangerous assignment that required her to maintain normal interactions with her stepmother while documenting evidence of treason. But Catherine's analytical skills and deep understanding of palace protocols made her uniquely qualified for the task. The first indication that the conspiracy was proceeding according to plan came at 10 o'clock in the morning, when Isabella requested an emergency meeting with Lord Pemberton under the pretext of discussing security arrangements for the evening's dinner. However, surveillance equipment in the meeting room captured a very different conversation, a final coordination session between two of the conspiracy's key figures. "The timeline remains unchanged," Pemberton was recorded saying. "The media packages will be released at 8:30 during the dinner's second course. By 9 o'clock, the evidence will be circulating through news networks and social media platforms. The king will have no choice but to address the allegations immediately." Isabella's response revealed the cold calculation behind her betrayal. Edward's initial reaction will be denial, which will only make the allegations more credible. When he realizes the extent of the evidence against him, he'll understand that abdication is his only option to preserve the monarchy's reputation. The recording equipment also captured details about fabricated financial documents that would implicate King Edward in corruption, forged intelligence reports suggesting he had shared state secrets with foreign governments, and manufactured evidence of personal improprieties designed to destroy his credibility with both the government and the public. Margaret listened to these recordings with growing amazement at the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. The plotters had anticipated every possible response and prepared countermeasures for each scenario. However, their confidence in their plan's success had also made them careless about security, providing the evidence needed to prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. As the afternoon progressed, arriving dignitaries and government officials began gathering at the palace for the evening's festivities. Among the guests were several individuals whom Margaret's investigation had identified as potential co-conspirators, including Foreign Secretary Michael Thornton and Defense Minister Patricia Carlisle. The presence of these high-ranking officials at what was intended to be the monarchy's downfall added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Catherine observed Isabella's preparations for the dinner with particular attention to any signs of nervousness or unusual behavior. However, Isabella appeared remarkably calm and composed, suggesting either exceptional self-control or complete confidence in her plan's success. She even took time to compliment Catherine on her evening gown and express hope that they would grow closer as family members in the coming years, a statement that took on sinister meaning given Isabella's true intentions. At 7 o'clock, guests began arriving for cocktails before the formal dinner service. The palace's grand ballroom had been transformed into an elegant setting worthy of international diplomacy, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables adorned with fresh flowers and the finest china. To any casual observer, it appeared to be exactly what it was supposed to be, a celebration of friendship between nations hosted by a stable and respected monarchy. However, in the Security Command Center, Margaret and her team monitored communications intercepts that revealed the conspiracy's final preparations. At precisely 8:15, coded messages were transmitted to media outlets around the world, containing the fabricated evidence designed to destroy King Edward's reputation. The packages included financial records, intelligence documents, and personal correspondence, all expertly forged but designed to appear authentic under initial scrutiny. The plan called for the evidence to be released simultaneously across multiple platforms during the dinner's second course, creating maximum impact while the king was publicly engaged with foreign dignitaries. The resulting media frenzy would make it impossible for Edward to respond effectively, while Isabella would be positioned to provide stability and leadership during the crisis. At 8:25, as the first course was being served in the grand ballroom, Margaret received confirmation that the media packages had been delivered and would be published within minutes. The moment of truth had arrived, and King Edward's carefully planned counter-strategy was about to be put to the test. Unknown to the conspirators, Margaret's team had spent the previous 24 hours working with friendly media contacts to prepare an alternative narrative. When the fabricated evidence was released, prepositioned journalists were ready with articles exposing the documents as forgeries and revealing the true story of the conspiracy against the monarchy. The counter-strategy's effectiveness became apparent almost immediately. Instead of the media frenzy that Isabella and her co-conspirators expected, news outlets began reporting on a dramatic royal intrigue involving foreign espionage and domestic betrayal. The fabricated evidence was quickly identified as fraudulent, while genuine evidence of the conspiracy began circulating through reliable journalistic channels. In the ballroom, Isabella noticed the change in atmosphere as guests began checking their phones and whispering urgently to one another. However, the news they were sharing was not what she had expected to hear. Instead of scandal surrounding King Edward, reports were emerging of a sophisticated plot against the monarchy that had been uncovered by royal security services. Catherine watched her stepmother's face carefully as the realization dawned that their plan had not only failed, but had been turned against them. Isabella's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the calculating intelligence that had orchestrated the conspiracy while also showing the first signs of panic as she understood that exposure was imminent. At 8:45, as dessert was being served, King Edward rose to address his guests. His speech, ostensibly thanking the ambassador of Meridia for strengthening diplomatic relations, was actually a carefully crafted message to the nation about the importance of loyalty, integrity, and the rule of law in democratic societies. "Throughout history," Edward said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom and to television audiences watching the live broadcast, "our nation has faced challenges from those who would undermine our institutions for personal gain. However, we have always found strength in our commitment to truth, justice, and the principles that bind us together as a free people." As he spoke, security teams throughout the palace began executing coordinated arrests of the conspiracy's participants. Sarah Chen was apprehended while attempting to leave the country with additional classified documents. Colonel Ravencroft was arrested at his apartment, along with communications equipment linked to foreign intelligence services. Lord Pemberton was taken into custody as he tried to leave the palace grounds through a service entrance. Isabella, realizing that her situation was hopeless, made one final desperate attempt to escape accountability by claiming that she had been manipulated and threatened by the other conspirators. However, the extensive surveillance evidence and her recorded conversations with Pemberton made such claims impossible to sustain. The arrests were conducted with discretion to avoid disrupting the state dinner, but by the time guests departed at 11 o'clock, news of the conspiracy's exposure and the arrests of its participants had spread around the world. Rather than witnessing the downfall of King Edward's reign, the international community had observed the strength and resilience of the democratic institutions the plotters had tried to destroy. In the days that followed, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear through detailed investigations and the cooperation of arrested conspirators seeking reduced sentences. The plot had involved foreign intelligence services seeking to destabilize the nation's government, domestic political figures pursuing personal ambition, and criminal organizations hoping to benefit from the resulting chaos. Isabella was formally charged with treason, espionage, and conspiracy against the crown. The evidence against her was overwhelming, including the recordings of her coordination meetings, the classified documents found in her possession, and testimony from other conspirators confirming her leadership role in the operation. King Edward faced the difficult personal challenge of reconciling his love for Isabella with the undeniable evidence of her betrayal. In a private moment with Catherine several weeks later, he acknowledged that his daughter's suspicions and careful investigation had likely prevented a constitutional crisis that could have destabilized the entire nation. "I will always be grateful that you had the courage to act on your concerns," he told Catherine as they walked through the palace gardens where Isabella had once taken her morning strolls. "Your loyalty to the crown, even when it meant potentially causing me personal pain, exemplifies the kind of dedication that our monarchy needs to survive and serve our people effectively." Catherine accepted her father's gratitude with the understanding that their family would need time to heal from the trauma of betrayal and deception. However, she also took pride in knowing that her vigilance and careful documentation had played a crucial role in protecting the institution she would someday inherit and lead. The conspiracy known as Operation Royal Flush had failed completely, but its exposure had strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy by demonstrating the effectiveness of the safeguards and the dedication of those sworn to protect the crown. The shadows that had infiltrated Eldermere Palace had been banished by the light of truth, ensuring that future generations would inherit institutions worthy of their loyalty and service. In the months that followed, comprehensive security reforms were implemented throughout the government, and new protocols were established to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. The royal family emerged from the crisis with enhanced credibility and public support, having demonstrated both their commitment to accountability and their ability to protect the democratic principles that formed the foundation of their constitutional role. The crown's shadow had been lifted, replaced by a renewed commitment to transparency, integrity, and service that would guide the monarchy through whatever challenges the future might bring.